Johnny Carson had one question left when Elizabeth Taylor started crying. He didn't ask it. The studio air conditioning had been broken for 3 hours before Elizabeth Taylor arrived. Johnny Carson sat in his dressing room with his tie loosened and his jacket on the back of a chair, listening to Fred de Cordova explain why the network wanted this interview to matter. Not just matter, dominate. It was May 1981. The Tonight Show had been king for 19 years, but the numbers were softening. ABC was gaining ground with Nightline. CBS was whispering about alternatives, and Elizabeth Taylor, recently widowed, had agreed to her first major interview since her husband's death. She had chosen Johnny. Fred de Cordova stood near the mirror, arms crossed, speaking in the calm, insistent voice he used when something was non-negotiable. The interview had to deliver. It had to feel intimate, emotional, revealing. It had to be the kind of television people would remember the next morning at work. Johnny sat very still, looking at his hands. He had a note card in his jacket pocket with 17 questions written in his own handwriting. The last question on the card was the one Fred wanted him to ask. It was about grief. It was personal. It was the kind of question that would make Elizabeth Taylor either open up completely or walk off the set. Either outcome, Fred had said, would be extraordinary television. Johnny said nothing. He nodded once. Fred left. The dressing room went quiet except for the hum of a portable fan someone had brought in to fight the heat. 30 minutes before taping, Johnny stood backstage near the curtain and watched the audience settle into their seats. They were louder than usual, restless with anticipation. Everyone knew Elizabeth Taylor was coming. Everyone wanted to see what she would say, how she would look, whether she would cry. Johnny could feel the energy in the room, the way a crowd shifts when they sense something might break open in front of them. He had spent 2 decades reading audiences, understanding what they wanted before they knew they wanted it. Tonight, they wanted vulnerability. They wanted to see a movie star stripped down to her grief. They wanted permission to stare at someone else's pain so they could feel something about their own. Doc Severinsen was tuning his trumpet near the bandstand. Ed McMahon walked over, grinning, holding a cup of coffee. Ed said something about the heat, about how Elizabeth Taylor probably wouldn't even break a sweat because she'd been through worse. Johnny smiled, a tight professional smile that meant nothing. Ed kept talking. Johnny heard none of it. He was thinking about the note card in his pocket and the last question he had written down 3 days earlier when the interview had still seemed like a good idea. Elizabeth Taylor arrived 16 minutes before airtime. Johnny didn't see her come in, but he heard the change in the hallway, the sudden hush, the sound of heels on linoleum, the low murmur of assistants speaking in reverent tones. She was in a private dressing room across the hall, behind a door that stayed closed. Fred de Cordova appeared next to Johnny, checking his watch, his face tight with controlled urgency. He reminded Johnny that they had 38 minutes of airtime to fill and that the pacing had to build. Start light, he said. Let her settle in, then go deeper. The audience has to feel like they're earning it. Johnny nodded again. He could feel the note card in his pocket like a stone. Fred walked away. Johnny stood there alone, listening to the audience applaud for a warm-up comedian he couldn't see. The show opened the way it always did. Johnny walked through the curtain to the sound of the band and the rising applause and the familiar rhythm of a veillon. Entrance he had performed more than 4,000 times. He delivered the monologue with the precision of a surgeon, timing, pauses, eyebrow raises, the small laugh he gave when a joke landed harder than expected. The audience loved him. They always did. But Johnny wasn't thinking about the monologue. He was thinking about the woman sitting in the dressing room across the hall, waiting to walk onto a stage in front of 300 strangers and 14 million people watching from home. He was thinking about what it felt like to be expected to explain your own sadness for entertainment. He finished the monologue. The applause came. He smiled. Ed laughed. Doc played a flourish. Johnny walked to his desk and sat down, and the cameras cut to commercial. Backstage, Elizabeth Taylor stood near the curtain. Johnny couldn't see her, but the stage manager could, and the stage manager's face told him everything. She looked composed, elegant, dressed in something dark and simple that made her look smaller than she was. Her hands were folded in front of her. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't nervous. She was doing what she had always done, performing the act of being Elizabeth Taylor in public while keeping everything that mattered locked behind her eyes. The stage manager counted down. Johnny straightened his tie. The band played. Ed McMahon's voice filled the studio with warmth and enthusiasm as he introduced the most famous actress in the world. The audience erupted. Elizabeth Taylor walked through the curtain, waving, smiling, and for a moment she was exactly who everyone expected her to be. She crossed the stage. Johnny stood. They kissed on the cheek, the way celebrities do when cameras are watching. She sat in the guest chair. He sat behind the desk. The applause faded. The interview began. Johnny started with the easy questions. He asked about her most recent film. He asked about her children. He asked about living in Los Angeles versus living abroad. Elizabeth Taylor answered with grace and humor, telling stories that felt rehearsed but not stiff, polished but still human. She laughed twice. The audience laughed with her. Johnny guided the conversation the way he always did, knowing when to lean in, when to pull back, when to let a silence sit for just a moment before filling it. The first 12 minutes were flawless. The audience was engaged. The cameras captured every angle. Fred de Cordova stood in the control room, watching the monitors, satisfied. Everything was going exactly as planned. And then Johnny asked about her late husband. He didn't ask it directly. He approached it carefully, the way a person walks across a frozen lake, testing the ice with each step. He mentioned that she had been traveling, that she had been spending time alone, that she seemed at peace despite everything that had happened. Elizabeth Taylor's face changed. Not dramatically, not in a way the audience would necessarily notice, but Johnny saw it. Her eyes shifted slightly downward, her hands, which had been resting lightly on the armrest, pressed down just a little harder. She nodded slowly and said yes, she had been finding peace. She said it quietly. Johnny waited. The audience waited. The camera held on her face. She began to talk about her husband, about the years they had spent together, about the trips they had taken, about the small routines of their life that no one else had seen. Her voice stayed steady. She smiled once, a sad, distant smile that wasn't for the audience. She was talking to herself, remembering something private. Johnny listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush her. He let her speak, and the silence between her sentences became the most important sound in the room. And then her voice cracked. It was a small thing. One word broke in the middle, and she stopped. She looked down at her hands. The audience went completely still. Johnny could feel them leaning forward in their seats. He could feel the camera zooming in, capturing the tremble in her jaw, the way her eyelashes flickered as she tried to hold herself together. This was the moment Fred de Cordova had wanted. This was the moment the network had planned for. This was the moment that would make the interview unforgettable. Johnny looked at Elizabeth Taylor. She looked like someone who had been asked to expose a wound she had been trying to let heal. She looked the way people look when they realize they've said too much and there's no way to take it back. She looked trapped. Johnny glanced down at the note card on his desk. He had placed it there before the interview started, turned slightly so the cameras wouldn't catch the writing. The last question was written in black ink, underlined twice. It was the question Fred had told him to ask. It was the question that would push the interview past ordinary into something people would talk about for years. It was about grief. It was about loss. It was about what it felt like to be alone after spending your life never being alone. It was the kind of question that would either make Elizabeth Taylor cry on camera or make her stand up and leave. Either way, it would be spectacular television. Johnny picked up the note card. The audience held its breath. Elizabeth Taylor looked up at him, waiting, her eyes already wet. The studio was silent except for the faint hum of the cameras. Johnny looked at the question. He looked at Elizabeth Taylor. He closed the note card. He set it down on the desk, face down, and leaned back in his chair. He smiled gently, the kind of smile that had nothing to do with comedy or performance. He said, "You know what, Elizabeth? Let's talk about something else." The audience didn't know what to do. There was a confused ripple of laughter, uncertain, waiting for the punchline. Elizabeth Taylor blinked. Her face shifted. The tightness in her jaw released. She exhaled long and slow, and her shoulders dropped. She looked at Johnny with something that wasn't gratitude. It was deeper than that. It was recognition. She nodded once, barely perceptible, and said, "Thank you." Johnny pivoted the conversation to something lighter. He asked about her favorite city. He asked about her dogs. He asked about a funny story from a film set in the 1960s. Elizabeth Taylor followed his lead, and within 2 minutes, she was laughing again, telling a story about Richard Burton and a stolen bottle of wine. The audience laughed with her. The tension dissolved. The interview continued for another 11 minutes, warm and charming and forgettable in all the best ways. When it ended, Elizabeth Taylor stood, kissed Johnny on the cheek again, and walked off stage to standing applause. Johnny waved, smiled, and turned to the camera for the next segment. The show continued. The audience never knew anything had been prevented. Fred de Cordova was waiting in the hallway when Johnny came off stage. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Johnny walked past him toward his dressing room. Fred followed. The door closed behind them. Fred asked what had happened. He asked why Johnny had cut the question. He asked if there had been a technical issue, a signal from the stage manager, something Johnny had seen that Fred had missed. Johnny stood near the mirror, a step loosening his tie. He said there was no issue. Fred stared at him. He said the network had been counting on that moment. He said the interview had been good, but it hadn't been great. He said they had a responsibility to the audience, to the show, to deliver something people couldn't get anywhere else. Johnny turned around. He looked at Fred, and his face was calm, but there was something in his eyes that Fred had never seen before. Johnny said, "She was crying, Fred." Fred nodded. He said, "I know. That's why you asked the question." Johnny didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He just said, "No." Fred opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. He looked at Johnny for a long moment, trying to understand what had just shifted between them. Johnny said nothing else. He turned back to the mirror and started removing his makeup. Fred stood there for another few seconds, then left without another word. The door clicked shut. Johnny sat down in the chair, alone, staring at his own reflection. The next morning, the reviews were mixed. Some critics praised the interview for its warmth and restraint. Others called it a missed opportunity, noting that Johnny Carson had pulled back just when the conversation was getting interesting. The ratings were strong, but not exceptional. The network executives made quiet notes about the missed emotional peak. No one called it a disaster. No one called it a triumph. It was just another episode of The Tonight Show, competent and professional and forgettable within a week. But Elizabeth Taylor remembered. 3 weeks later, Johnny received a handwritten note at the studio. It was short, written on cream-colored stationery with no return address. It said, "You didn't have to do that, but you did. I won't forget." It was signed simply, E. Johnny read it once, folded it carefully, and put it in his desk drawer. He never mentioned it to anyone. He never brought it up in interviews or memoirs or casual conversations with friends. It stayed private, the way the moment itself had stayed private, even though it had happened in front of millions of people. Years later, after Johnny Carson had retired and disappeared from public life, a young television producer asked him about the Elizabeth Taylor interview during a rare public appearance. The producer wanted to know if Johnny regretted not pushing harder, not asking the difficult questions, not mining the emotional depth that everyone knew was there. Johnny thought about it for a moment. He said, "I don't think about it as something I didn't do. I think about it as something I chose not to do. There's a difference." The producer nodded, not quite understanding. Johnny didn't explain further. He had learned a long time ago that some things couldn't be explained, only felt. The moment with Elizabeth Taylor had been one of those things. It wasn't about the interview. It wasn't about the ratings or the reviews or the network's expectations. It was about looking at another human being and recognizing the exact moment when kindness mattered more than success. Johnny Carson built his career on understanding what audiences wanted. He knew when to push and when to pull back. He knew when to let a joke breathe and when to cut it short. He knew how to make celebrities comfortable and how to make them squirm. He knew, more than almost anyone in the history of television, how to turn a conversation into a performance that felt spontaneous even when every beat was calculated. But the thing no one talks about, the thing that gets forgotten in the legend of Johnny Carson, is that he also knew when to stop performing. He knew when the cameras didn't matter. He knew when the audience's desire for spectacle became a demand for cruelty. And he knew that the most powerful thing a person can do on live television isn't to ask the question everyone wants to hear. It's to know when not to ask it at all. The night of the Elizabeth Taylor interview, Johnny Carson had one question left. It was written on a note card. It was the question the network wanted. It was the question the audience was waiting for. It was the question that would have made the interview legendary. And Johnny Carson, in front of 14 million people, chose not to ask it. Elizabeth Taylor cried anyway, just a little, just enough. But she cried because someone had seen her, not because someone had exposed her. She cried because Johnny Carson had given her permission to stop performing, and that permission, quiet and unremarkable and never mentioned in the reviews, was the rarest thing television had ever offered. Fred de Cordova never brought it up again. The network moved on to the next episode, the next guest, the next ratings battle. Johnny Carson continued hosting The Tonight Show for another 11 years, delivering thousands more interviews, asking thousands more questions, building a legacy that would define late-night television for generations. But he never forgot the moment he closed that note card. He never forgot the look on Elizabeth Taylor's face when he pivoted away from her grief. He never forgot the weight of choosing decency over spectacle, even when spectacle was his job. And late at night, alone in his home in Malibu, long after the cameras had stopped rolling and the audience had gone home, Johnny Carson would sometimes think about that interview. He would think about the question he didn't ask. He would think about the career he had built on asking questions, on pushing celebrities just far enough to reveal something true. And he would wonder if the most honest thing he had ever done on television was the thing no one had noticed. The silence he had chosen, the question he had kept to himself. The moment he had decided that some things mattered more than being memorable. Elizabeth Taylor died in 2011. Johnny Carson had died 7 years earlier. The Tonight Show continued without him, hosted by other men who asked other questions in front of other audiences. The interview from May 1981 was never considered one of Johnny's greatest moments. It didn't make the highlight reels. It didn't get replayed during tribute specials. It was just another episode, archived and forgotten, watched only by researchers and historians looking for something else. But if you go back and watch it now, if you pay attention to the moment when Johnny closes the note card and pivots the conversation, you can see something. It's subtle. It's easy to miss, but it's there. Elizabeth Taylor's face changes. The fear leaves her eyes. And for just a second, Johnny Carson stops being a television host and becomes exactly what she needed him to be, a human being who understood that some questions don't deserve to be answered just because people want to hear the answer. That's the moment. That's the fracture. That's the thing television was never supposed to show. Not the crying, not the grief, not the spectacle of a movie star breaking down on camera, but the choice not to make her. The decision, quiet and irreversible, to value someone's dignity over everyone's curiosity. The network was furious, not openly, not in a way that made headlines, but in the quiet, bureaucratic way that networks express disappointment. Fred de Cordova received notes. Johnny received notes. There were conversations about maximizing moments and fulfilling audience expectations and leveraging emotional opportunities. Johnny listened. He nodded. He went back to work, and he never asked that kind of question again. People who worked with Johnny Carson for years would tell you he was impossible to know. He was warm on camera and distant off it. He was generous with his time and stingy with his trust. He made millions of people laugh and kept almost no close friends. He was a man who performed intimacy for a living while protecting his own privacy with obsessive care. But every once in a while, someone who worked on The Tonight Show would mention the Elizabeth Taylor interview. Not because it was memorable, not because it changed anything, but because it was the moment they realized Johnny Carson had a line. And the line wasn't where they expected it to be. It wasn't about politics or controversy or scandal. It was about pain. It was about recognizing when another person was at the edge of something they couldn't take back. And it was about deciding in real time in front of millions of people that his job wasn't to push them over that edge just to see what would happen. That's the cost of decency. That's what gets lost when we talk about legendary television moments and iconic interviews and the greatest hosts of all time. We remember the times they made people cry. We remember the times they pushed too far and got something real. We remember the spectacle. We forget the moments when they chose not to create one. Johnny Carson had one question left. It was the question everyone wanted to hear. It was the question that would have made the interview unforgettable. He looked at Elizabeth Taylor. He saw her trembling at the edge of her own grief, and he chose not to ask it. The audience never knew what they missed. The network never forgave him. And Elizabeth Taylor, for the rest of her life, carried a small folded note in her wallet that said, "You didn't have to do that, but you did." That's the story. That's the fracture. That's the moment television was never meant to show. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet. Not because it revealed everything, but because it protected something. Not because Johnny Carson broke his own rules, but because he finally understood what those rules were for. Some questions don't need to be asked. Some pain doesn't need to be witnessed. Some moments of human decency happen in front of millions of people and disappear without a trace because they look like nothing at all. Unless you know what to look for. Unless you understand that the most powerful thing a person can do isn't always the thing people remember. Sometimes it's the thing they never notice, the question that stays unasked, the silence that says everything, the choice made in an instant to be kind instead of memorable. Johnny Carson had 38 minutes of airtime to fill. He had a note card with 17 questions. He had an audience that wanted to see a movie star cry. He had a network that expected him to deliver. And he had one moment, unremarkable and irreversible, to decide what kind of man he was going to be. He closed the note card. He changed the subject. He let Elizabeth Taylor leave with her dignity intact. And nobody talked about it the next day. That's how you know it mattered.